Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Ray Edmondson, and I'm an assistant professor of theater history and dramaturgy here at UCF. And I'd like to give a warm welcome to my usual Theater History 3 class who's here with me on this Zoom call. This is an open house classroom that we're trying out this semester. It's the second of two that we're doing. And our goal with these is really to share with the greater UCF community some of the exciting learning and collaboration and reading and thinking that's going on here in our theater classroom. So thank you to the theater history class that's here, and also any folks that are also joining us in the live stream on YouTube. Just as a note to my friends in our class, the session is being live streamed and recorded. And if you're viewing the live stream on YouTube and you have a question, you can type it into the live chat and we'll try to address it later. And later on, this link will be available on YouTube, so y'all can go share it with your friends. So now I wanted to extend a warm thanks to Dr. Donatella Galella for volunteering your time and knowledge today. A big thanks to Stephen Risco, who is helping us manage the Zoom functions here right now with us today, the UCF dramaturgs who have been really helpful in planning all of these great talks in open classrooms, and of course the School of Performing Arts for your support. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Donatella Galella, who is an associate professor of theater at the University of California, Riverside. She's also the author of America in the Round, Capital, Race, and Nation at Washington, D.C.'s Arena Stage, published by University of Iowa Press in 2019. She researches how racism and capitalism shape and are shaped by popular contemporary U.S. theater. Her writing has appeared in many venues, including Theater Journal, Theater Survey, Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, and Reframing the Musical, Race, Culture, and Identity. And when I approached Donatella about doing this class, it was actually Donatella who reminded me that this was the day after the election that we would be having this conversation. And I was just like focused on my syllabi and trying to get my dates filled. And actually like it caused me to pause. Is this the right thing to do? And I still don't know if it's the right thing to do, but I think that there's going to be a lot of relevant things that we can work into our conversation today as we process the chaos that is currently consuming our nation. So that's it from me. Donatella, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you so much for welcoming me to your class today, to the University of Central Florida. Chloe and I went to graduate school together, and it's just an honor to reunite and be in this space with you. I want to echo what she was saying, that, you know what, I'll also introduce, this is my 9-month-old baby, Arcadia. She says hi, and we call her Katie for short, and we both use she, her, hers pronouns. So I wanted to echo what she was saying about recognizing the moment we're in, the anxiety that many of us are feeling, and that our feelings are valid and rational. So I just wanted to say that and let you know that we'll conclude class by specifically attending to our historical moment with regard to Hamilton. So wait for it, wait for it. So I want to start off class today. We're going to be focusing on thinking through the politics of multiracial casting in Hamilton. So let's begin with a very short 1-minute writing prompt for yourselves, in which I'd like you to reflect on what was the first time that you saw a professional musical production where there were actors of color playing roles that would typically be played by white actors. So just take a minute to remember for yourself and write that down. And then what we'll do is share it if you feel comfortable doing that verbally or in the chat. And when you do share, please let me know, who you are and if you want to share your pronoun or not. And I'll say for myself, as you're thinking through this, that my first experience was in 1999. So I was 12 and I saw You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown on Broadway. And in the cast, there was B.D. Wong playing Linus and Stanley Wayne Mathis, who is a Black actor, playing Schroeder. And I remember as a child thinking, this isn't what the characters in Peanuts typically look like, and I was a little confused, but then I very quickly accepted it, and I'm so grateful that I got to have that early experience challenging the kind of accepted norms that I had already been taught at that age. And then it was super cool to be able to work with BD years later and to see that he has Linus towels in his bathroom. So that just had a really big impact on me as a young Asian American. So I wonder if anyone is willing to share their experience.
Hi, so my name is Alyssa. I go by she, her pronouns. And I don't know if this was my first experience, but it was the first time that I really thought about it watching Frozen 2, not the musical, although the musical too, but watching Frozen 2, seeing animated Black characters who in that time would not have been Black people was interesting to me and something that I really thought about. And I was like, why not represent people who in a time would not have been colored?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Alyssa. And it reminds me that there are magical trolls in the world of Frozen as well. And so there are all these questions about historicity, accuracy, and often that's used to police the bounds of race and whether or not people of color can be included. And I'm seeing in the chat Alexander and Charlie mentioning The Wiz, which is an all-Black take on The Wizard of Oz. Does anyone else want to share? Yeah, Giovanna.
Hi, I'm Giovanna. I use she, her pronouns. And the first time it really hit me was when I went to go see SpongeBob the Musical on Broadway, and seeing the character of Pearl played by a Black actress was something that it was different from what I was raised from in my childhood, thinking of having a white actor playing this, I guess, white coded character, but it didn't change any of the integrity of the character at all, seeing a person of color play it. And it actually was really inspiring to myself, a person of color, to see somebody amplify a role in such a way where it made a difference, but also was normal. And it was amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Giovanna. That's right. We have Pearl and her father. She's like a whale and her dad's a crab. And so it also begs the question, like maybe racialization wouldn't work the way we think it normally does. And then there are also ways dramaturgically we can read this casting. I'm thinking also of how Sandy Squirrel is played by a Black actress, and most of the rest of the cast for the lead roles are white actors. And there's something about her being an outsider, right? And so there are ways that we can read her body and her racial identity into the character and into the storytelling. All right, anybody else? It's also okay for people to say Hamilton was your first. Please go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Emily Rodriguez. I go by she or her. I don't know if it pertains to the same thing, but I guess it's kind of like the opposite. When I was younger, my high school did a production of In the Heights, and most of the production crew or the cast was all Caucasian. And it was just like different to like see this approach because I'm Hispanic, and like, you know, I know like some of the songs are mainly in Spanish, so it was just, I guess, different to see them attempting at it, even if it was like for a thespian show and whatnot. It just kind of felt like not as authentic, I guess, almost like a West Side Story kind of deal, how they did it back then. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Emily, that's unfortunately a very common experience. I guess I say unfortunately because, so on the one hand, right, Latinx folks span a huge range of colors, backgrounds, cultures. And on the other hand, there's a potential for a kind of whitewashing in eliminating a specificity in Latinx culture in Washington Heights. So there's definitely like a necessary negotiation there. And I'm going to try to find and put into the chat, there's a really compelling article by Professor Brian Herrera, who researched what happens when different schools put on in the Heights with different kinds of caste makeup, some that were mostly Anglo, some mostly Latinx, and even having, for instance, at UC Riverside, where I hail from, that there was an Asian American who played Benny. And so I think that's also really interesting, so that he's sort of positioned as different from the Latinx community. Oh, thank you so much, great. Yeah, I think it's called, But Do We Have the Actors for That in Theater Topics? Great. So I want to keep building on this conversation and these experiences that we've shared to think through, like, what did it mean for you to see actors of color in these otherwise typically white roles? And you can talk about the experiences you've already shared, or you can start reflecting on Hamilton. Yeah, Maggie.
I'm sorry, that was an accident. Hi. Yeah, sorry.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I go by she, her, hers. I remember, this wasn't even that long ago, and I can't remember the actress's name, but it was when they were thinking of doing a live action Ariel and casting it as a Black woman. And there was a huge spark in conversation like, oh, that's wrong. Ariel's white. Ariel needs to be white. And then the other part was why? Like, where does this come from? It's a cartoon and it's a fish person. It's a fish. It doesn't need to be a white person. But I remember that huge conversation of where a huge divide of, it can't be a Black person. Oh, but why can't it? And I think that sparked a lot of different, oh yeah, Halle Bailey is who it was. And it was kind of this, like a year ago, I feel like. It was not that long ago.
Yeah, so what Lauren's touching upon is certainly that sometimes when you do that kind of inclusive casting, sometimes there's white backlash to it because it's not the way it's supposed to be. But as Lauren's pointing out, you know, mermaids are not, again, real, maybe. And also there's a history and culture of some, I think, Afro-Caribbean cultures that I believe like think about Black mermaids as possibilities as well. So there is precedent for thinking through this. And again, there's just like a policing of roles, which we need to consider is not just about representation, but also about resources. Because when you continue to deny these parts to people of color, then they don't get to have that on their resume. They don't get to have that experience to hone their craft. And then they don't get to have that to land the next job. So it's not, and it's also about money, right? It's about paying your rent. And so there are all these other material factors in everyday life, in addition to how is this affecting the storytelling for the audience on stage. I see that Isaiah in the chat is writing about, on the topic of not having the people for shows that they were in a production about police brutality, and they were pretty much the only character of color in the program. So they played a kid who was brutalized and everyone else was white, or white people played Black people, and it was crazy. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That sounds to me like very messy dramaturgy, so that the storytelling doesn't even make sense, and that there's a lot of like burden put on you for doing that work. It did sound like maybe they were trying to identify like systemic white racial violence, but in a way that was not clear. You want to add something?
Yeah, it was, so what it was I'm from Maryland, and we had we have this like whole Read Across Maryland thing where the libraries, they pick a book that everyone in the state's supposed to read. So like everybody has something they can talk about. It's like to anybody else. And the book they picked was All American Boys, which great book. But it's about these two young boys. One whose name is Rashad is brutalized after mistakes, like a cop thought he was stealing like a bag of chips, but he wasn't, and he was assaulted. And but basically what happened was we had one of the better theater companies in the state, high school wise, so they asked us to do a stage version of that show. And I don't know if it was because we thought it was an important story to tell, or just because my director wanted to do more theater, even though I was basically the only person of color, let alone the only Black person, and I'm only half Black consistently in our program. So what basically ended up happening was we ended up doing the show, but how we did it was I was the character playing Rashad, but how we did all of the other characters is because we basically we were like 99% white people with a couple people of color. So what ended up happening was we differentiated based off of binders because it was a staged reading. So if you were an African-American person, you read out of a Black binder. And if you were supposed to be playing a white person, you would play have a white binder. So there were like 2-3 other people of color in the show, and some of them were cast as like white people, I think. So it was to like keep it like, oh, we're just mixing up all the races. But it was just really uncomfortable for everybody.
Yeah, thanks for walking us through that, Isaiah. That sounds like a mess. And it's interesting that it was a reading, which I think sometimes, and an educational production. And so sometimes that helps to rationalize why people's racial identities are not necessarily matching their characters, because there's this kind of like distance here as opposed to mimetic realism, like a matchy-matchy casting, I think is what Brian Herrera calls it. In the chat, we're also seeing that Alexander expressed that when they were younger, they never really thought about seeing people of color in traditionally white roles as strange, and they were just excited to see the characters brought to life no matter what they looked like. And I totally hear that, especially if that is normal for you when you're brought up, right? As opposed to like there being a white mold that's set and then strangely broken, right? And so early on, whatever we're watching is teaching us about how do we understand race and racism. And then we're also seeing examples of Yara Shahidi as Tinkerbell and Jelani Aladdin as Kristoff in Frozen on Broadway, and when he was also Hercules for Shakespeare in the Park, which was amazing. All right, great. So it sounds like there are a range of ways that we try to make sense of this kind of multiracial casting, that sometimes we think about how does the actor's identity relate to the character in the story. Sometimes we're like, this doesn't matter. This is just a really talented person, or this is a made up world where they're not even playing humans, so I'm just gonna get over this. Sometimes it's messy because an actor of color is playing a person of color, but then there are white people playing people of color, there are people of color playing white people, so then you're like, oh, maybe it doesn't matter because this doesn't add up. It's not consistent, just like the babbling baby is saying. So I wanted to try to map that onto how, in my own research on multiracial casting in contemporary musicals, I've identified 3 main modes of how we understand casting. And so I call them first multiracial, the second is whitened, and the third is post-racial. So multiracial casting is when you have a cast that has white people and people of color, and the actors are playing characters in such a way that their own personal racial identity is understood to be the same as the characters whom they're playing. So it's like, oh, I see a Black actress playing Lori in Oklahoma. So that means Lori is Black, and Aunt Eller, her aunt, is also played by a Black actor. So this just must be like a Black family. And then if Curly is played by an indigenous white Latino actor, then you're like, oh, like that's the mixture for Curly, and that's an interracial relationship. Like, oh, that's so interesting. But if there's a whitened version, instead you're like, well, they never talk about race or racism in the script, and they're not treating each other differently. It seems like we're in like the early 1900s in Oklahoma. So maybe they are people of color actors, but they're just playing white people, and I'm just not supposed to read too much into it. So the characters become even more whitened. And then the third way you can read something is you can say, you know what, none of this makes sense. Obama solved racism. We're in a post-racial world, so I'm just not even gonna bother thinking about it. And I'm just gonna pretend that race doesn't matter on stage, and I'm gonna walk out of the theater and pretend that race does not matter out there either. I'm very glad that Katie's offering commentary because, so just so you know, a majority of white Americans don't think that systemic racism exists, even though we have many studies about disparities in health outcomes. For example, the life expectancy for Black people is many years less than for a typical white person in this country. Doctors think that Black people naturally feel less pain than white people. Black people receive just worse medical treatment. They're not just given the same care. We know, for instance, I think in Boston, the like median wealth for a white family is like more than $100,000, and for a Black family, it's $8. So there are just all these different things, from housing to income to education to policing to our criminal justice system to just hate crimes to health. Everything is structured by systemic white supremacy. And when people are taught that it doesn't even exist, that helps to maintain systemic white supremacy. And so it can be, on the one hand, really liberating when you're seeing a cast of color in a traditionally white show. You're like, oh my gosh, I've never seen someone like myself on stage. This is such an inclusive, diverse version of the country. And on the other hand, it's like, well, if it doesn't make sense with the story though, and I'm already getting all these messages in my culture that racism doesn't even exist, then I'm just gonna act like it doesn't matter. And I'm gonna carry that behavior out into the world and to, you know, the voting polls and to the way I grade students. Like, just so you know, like white teachers, if they think, like there are tests, right? When you like give teachers different assignments, but you change the racialization of the name. So if the name is like James versus Jamal, the teacher will give a lower grade to Jamal, even if it's the exact same assignment. And it was just like a scientific experiment to see how you would treat people. So that happens also with job resumes, and that a Black applicant needs to have 4 more years of experience than the white applicant to be treated the same way, in the sense of getting a callback for an interview for that job. Even if they have the same resume, they're just treated unequally based on the perception of the person looking at the resume and looking at the names and what race they think that person has. And so that's also to say that we're all implicated in this. There aren't exceptions, you know, like I'm embedded in white supremacy, and I just try to do anti-racist work to remedy that. But I don't deny that I'm not part of it, because I know that I am, and that's a first step. And you have to teach people while they're young about that, because the first step to dismantle these structures of power is to acknowledge that they are there. So, these are these 3 modes that I use for trying to understand casting, and that also when you're an audience member watching these shows, or you're a director putting it on, it's not necessarily one mode the whole time. You can actually switch in between and be like, oh, that line that actor said, suddenly I'm reminded of their race, and it creates this new meaning. And then other times you're like, no, they're playing a white person. So you can also just like switch back and forth depending on what the scene is, for example. So given all of that, I wonder about, how do you think the casting is operating in the musical Hamilton?
Hi. I don't know how to raise my hand. My name's Sam. I go by she, her. I've been doing my dramaturgy paper actually on Hamilton. So I've been doing a ton of reading about the different, like the racial casting. Something has come up a couple times that has been interesting, because I know that as a common opinion, it's a good thing. It gives people of color more opportunities to have a role on Broadway that they wouldn't otherwise have, because a lot of people are there's a lot of Broadway politics behind colorblind casting, but also there's an opinion that I saw like in one of the books I was reading. Sorry, I'm rambling. In one of the books I was reading, it was an article where this girl was like hammering in on like, this is not colorblind casting. We are going, like, you can tell what they are trying to do. They are trying to cast people of color, like the song that Eliza sings, even though it's sung by an Asian American, it sounds like traditionally whiter than like the rap song that Lafayette sings in the scene prior. Like they're meant to be like certain races and certain roles, which I think over the past couple of years of like touring, when like different people of color have been in different roles, like Asians and like Hispanics and African Americans have been in like different, like moved into different spots of the cast. But at the same time, it's something that I never really thought about before, of looking at it, because I've always been on the side of like, yeah, it's a good thing, but on the other side, it's like, it's also, it's a weird, like, it's a weird ground to stand on. There's also been a couple of comments in some of the things I've read of like, it erases the people of color who were actually there at the time, because every white person's being played by a person of color. So there are no roles to symbolize actual people of color at the time. So it's just been really interesting to read all of the opinions that different people have about it, and like think about it a little bit more expansively.
Yeah, Sam, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. And I think what you're suggesting is like, it's not either or, but both and, that there can be good aspects of this kind of casting in Hamilton, but then there are also drawbacks. And I also appreciated that you noted that you can analyze the original cast, but there have been so many cast replacements, so many tours and other productions like in Chicago. And so that opens up other ways to read different characters based on the new people bringing their own identities to that casting. And then also when you change one person, it doesn't just affect that character, it affects everyone else in relation to that person. So there are like all these ripple effects of that. And I was also grateful, I think you had a point that I'm blanking on right now. It was toward the end of your comment. Do you recall?
That because every white historical character, yeah, that.
Yes, yeah, and so I appreciated that too, because you're right, then it leaves no room, or at least it's confusing for if there are actual historic people of color. And as I noted in my essay, there's only that one like brief moment with Sally Hemings, who is, I think, in the original production, in the Disney version that you might have seen, is played by a Black woman. And so that resonates with the real history of Sally Hemings. And then it's interesting that she's playing across to be Diggs as Thomas Jefferson, who, like, I don't want to mince words, like, he was a rapist. And for me, it's like not cool that she's like shimmying and giving him the letter and smiling, even as I understand that the rest of the cast is also playing enslaved people in that moment. And they're like washing the floors and they're wearing like white gloves and sort of holding themselves in this particular way in relation to him. But because it's like a multiracial cast, you're like, are they all playing Black people? And then this other element that a lot of people forget is there are white people in the cast, and those white people are playing white people, from Samuel Seabury to the king, right? So, and they're often cast as like the bad people, and they're cast as British, and not Americans who are positioned as the good people of color who are playing white people. So that's also this dynamic that has been held, I believe, like throughout different productions, although in one of the original workshops, a person of color did play King George, but then they dropped that idea. Does anyone else want to share their theories about how is this casting working in Hamilton? How do you make sense of it?
Hi, I'm Issa, pronounced she, her. I know when I first saw it, which I love that how there's so much research on it now because I like to learn about it. But I know when I first watched it, I was like, wow, so cool. What if, people of color had always been given, the same opportunities to hold positions of power throughout history? Oh, little baby. And then, and then now that that's becoming a more common thing in, I think in media and entertainment, is kind of putting people of color in these usually white places of either power or, they have more, I don't know, but I don't know if anybody's watched the Netflix series Hollywood, where they kind of talked about that thing where what if we had given people of color the opportunities years ago and it's not just happening now. So I think it's an interesting conversation to make people think, but I do think depending where you put it, it can have, some negative implications. Like how you were saying, it's like some of these white people were not great. And then if you put people of color in it, then people are attaching that as, oh, well, maybe they weren't that bad. I don't know. I think it just creates important conversation, but that's kind of my reaction.
Yeah, thanks, Issa. I think you're right that there's something about casting people of color to play evil white people that helps to rehabilitate their reputations as like, oh, yeah, they're not that bad. And your kind of historical counterfactual example of Hollywood, which I see you're getting props from Giovanna and Emily, that it does pose that question and remind us that a lot of people have been taught that meritocracy is real, so that people have power, they have leadership positions, they get theatrical roles because they deserve it, because they're the best. And when we acknowledge that actually we live in this system of oppression and bias, then you realize, what if there are all these excellent people of color who were just not given the opportunity? How much art have we lost? How many smart policies to make a better, more sustainable, fairer world could we have implemented earlier if such people were given that chance? And so I really enjoyed that about Hollywood. And in asking these questions, I think that Hamilton implies, it doesn't explicitly address that, but it suggests, like, what if we had not had slavery and we could have had more Black leaders? And at the same time, though, it doesn't engage with the fact that there were free Black people who were making huge contributions to the founding of the United States. So it raises all those questions. Also, though, I have to say Hollywood is funny because it imagines, like, what if Ryan Murphy like solved racism in the 1940s or whatever. And so there's like a problem when you think, oh, it's so easy to fix. But I also understand that he frames the show as about dreamland. And so he acknowledges this is a fantasy, but asks the what if question. Yes, and I see that Alicia is pointing to the erasure of Native peoples. Yes, Giovanni's example of the Kendall Jenner Pepsi commercial. You know, the police in this country kill about 1,100 Americans every year. This doesn't happen in other countries like Canada. It's like 10 people a year. But it turns out you could just give a Pepsi to a cop and they won't shoot you. So like, facts are facts, America, to quote Monique Hart from Drag Race. So there's also a problem when people underestimate the depths and pervasiveness of white supremacy that makes it, again, harder to fight if people just aren't even recognizing how bad things are, how unequal things are. Yeah, so I also just want to, I've returned to this point that Alicia's making about, I think, Indigenous genocide, not just in the sense of literally killing people, but also in the sense of erasing a culture and heritage. And at the same time, we have to remember Native survivance, that a lot of times portrayals of Native Americans situate them in the past as if that's only when they exist, as opposed to acknowledging they continue to exist to this day, and there are more than 500 recognized Native nations here in the United States. So it's also troubling that I think Hamilton, at least in the original cast, doesn't necessarily have Native American actors. And as I point out in my essay, there are just these brief moments when the characters, the American characters, will talk about land belonging to them as white colonizers. And we're supposed to imagine this as freedom, as unquestionably good, as opposed to acknowledging the genocide upon which this nation has been built and the settler colonial violence that exists with our very occupation today. Melissa made a great joke about we've been doing it wrong by giving cops Coke instead of Pepsi. Oops. I'm thinking now of like, oops, accidental racism. So let's see. So we've been talking about how we're making sense of the casting, and I've been touching upon my article. So I wonder if we can use this as a transition to discuss that. I know that your professor assigned something that I wrote, and so I wondered, I guess, what do you think is the main argument that I'm making in the article, being in the room where it happens, Hamilton, Obama, and nationalist neoliberal multicultural inclusion? And then after we identify what the thesis is, let's talk about which parts did you agree with, which parts did you disagree with, and why. And also you can tell me about like, what did you find challenging about it? And then I invite your questions to me about that article. So, but first things first, what is that like first core argument that you think I'm trying to make? And Isaiah's adding in the chat that another issue is about how people of color are systematically kept out of the theater, and theater is a privilege in itself. I think that's true both symbolically, that a lot of people of color are not made to feel welcome, on top of economic barriers to theater.
I think a big point that you're making is that all of this is tied to economics in a way, and like how, sorry, my brain is blanking, but how like we sort of put these people of color to be like representative of all people of color just because they have money, and we're able to put them high up on this pedestal, and we use them as the example of all people of color.
Yeah, that's right on, Alyssa, that in the United States, we have this tendency to elevate someone like Oprah, someone like Barack Obama, to say that, well, racism can't possibly exist if there are these couple of very successful people of color. And if they can do it, surely you can do it as well, right? And so we're taught to believe this. And then what that does is make us forget about the reality, which is that there are all these obstacles to success. And then it's just very dangerous when we're taught that those obstacles don't exist. It's really like gaslighting to be told that something's not there when it is actually there. Yeah, what else do you think is my thesis, Katie? Oh, really?
I don't know. I'm going to be honest. You are such a passionate writer. I had to read the article about 2 or 3 times to read it, but it was really good, really interesting. And I screenshotted something. And I would kind of like for you to go in depth. You quoted, or you wrote, Hamilton operates 3 modes of casting interpretation: multiracial, conscious, whitened, and post-racial. When the legible race of actors maps onto their respective characters, and multiracial, and so on. You kind of wrote like a whole statement about it, and I guess I kind of wanted you to elaborate on those 3 modes that you were talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. This is getting back to like the core of our lesson for today. So let's take an example. Let's think about, for example, you know, in the essay, I mostly talk about Leslie Odom Jr. as an example, but let's talk about David Diggs instead. I know. I thought you liked him. No? Okay. So David Diggs, as a Black actor, he's first playing Lafayette. So in the multiracial mode, you might say to yourself, oh, he's like, we're supposed to think of Lafayette as a Black man in this case. And the whole first act tries to portray the American Revolution as about ending slavery, which it absolutely was not and did not. And so there's a way that you might therefore think about that because of the casting of David Diggs and thinking of Lafayette as Black, even though literally that historical character was a white Frenchman. And then that might also resonate with lines like, immigrants, we get the job done, right? And when he high fives Hamilton. And so you might think to yourself, ah, yes, like this is an actor of color playing this character who's an immigrant. And so it resonates with this idea of systemic xenophobia in the United States, but then celebrating the welcoming of this like exceptional immigrant. And that just becomes like more amplified by having an actor of color playing that role. At the same time, you could think to yourself, well, Lafayette was a white dude, so it doesn't make any sense for him really to think of the character as Black, particularly when we consider that he's not really an immigrant. He's just a guy from France who came to the US for a brief period and then he went back to France. And that's not what the word immigrant means. And especially when we often color code immigration, even though white immigrants exist, but we often think of them in a racialized of color way. And so it just like doesn't make sense if you're realizing, no, he's like a white historic figure with tremendous privilege and resources, which is how he was able to mobilize all of that for the side of the Americans. So then the last mode of post-racial is you might consider all of that. Like, okay, we have a Black actor playing this white character, and this isn't really adding up for me. And again, like, didn't Obama fix racism? It's 2015. It was a simpler time. So you might think to yourself, okay, well, that means we've overcome racism. It means that race doesn't matter, and I'm not going to read too much into Lafayette being played by a Black actor. So is that a little clearer of like using one example of one actor and one character and how you can like look at it through these different modes to try to process what's happening with the story and that person? Yeah, Lauren.
I think going off of what you said, that all makes sense. But going off of what you said earlier, talking about kind of being told like something doesn't exist and we're kind of conditioned in that mentality. I think about specifically in the theater community before Hamilton, before like Black people and BIPOC individuals were on stage, really like the one thing we had before was like the only thing was like the Lion King. The Lion King was like, it was the Black musical. It was like, oh, like that is for Black people, like that's for Black actors. And that kind of really, when you think about it, the bar is so low when you consider that Lion King and kind of commoditizing, that's not a word, on that African culture and on the African thing. So this is for you. This is what we're going to give you, this one musical that kind of talks about that. And that's the only thing you're going to have. And then the next being Hamilton, which I think was why it was so huge in being like, oh yes, this is a better thing because now they're representing actual people and not animals, not literal animals. They're just, oh, people, they get to actually kind of play humans. And I think that really says something about where the bar is and in the theater community in general and how white supremacy is there. And I think you talk about that a little bit in your article, which was amazing to read, super eye-opening.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And I think you're getting at this other central conceit of my work about who is allowed into the room where it happens. And we can think of that in this case as Broadway. So what are the conditions for getting a ticket inside? Like, what is the cost that you have to pay? And the cost is sometimes you just have to play an animal. Sometimes you have to be in this sort of generalized African culture and you have to wear a very heavy mask and costume that might break your neck, right? A lot of actors who've been in that show have suffered from various kinds of ailments. I'm also thinking of, in Hamilton, obviously the price is, well, you're going to have to play an enslaver. You're going to have to celebrate how great this country is. And on the one hand, it's like, Leslie Odom Jr. goes so hard. I was watching the Disney version, having, seen the show live a couple of times when it originally came out off Broadway and on Broadway. And it's such an extraordinary role for him to play Burr. And you'll notice that since then, he hasn't gotten that kind of opportunity again on stage. And so you have to ask yourself why. And your answer can't be like, because he's not good enough, because he is excellent and he shows that. And so it has to be something else. And I'm seeing in the chat things like Giovanna pointing out capitalism, and that's part of it. It's this idea of what is the kind of representation that is going to sell enough, that is going to get enough interest from producers to put up the millions of dollars to back up a show. And it turns out that only certain kinds of non-radical representations of people of color is what will attract people. So in the same season of Hamilton, we saw that Shuffle Along, which was a show directed by George C. Wolfe and was originally a musical from 1921 that's often regarded as one of the first created all-Black cast musicals in Broadway that helped to integrate the audience in the orchestra seating. And so George C. Wolfe kind of rewrote it as a history about that musical, and it wasn't very popular. And another show from that season was Allegiance, which is about World War II Japanese American internment. And guess what? Turns out Broadway audiences aren't really interested in learning about the implication of American history in imprisoning 120,000 Japanese Americans. You can have Leah Salonga, you can have George Takei in the show, and it's not enough. So it raises these questions about what are the conditions that enable Black actors to have any kind of representation on the Great White Way. I'm also seeing, again in the chat, Alyssa saying someone came last year to talk about trying to produce a show with a Black cast, and the casting directors on Broadway said, because Hamilton is on tour, there are no Black actors to cast. That's ridiculous. There are actually lots of Black actors, and I will try to find and put in the chat the latest report from the Asian American Performers Action Coalition. So this is their website. They are the only people who keep track of all the shows on Broadway and off Broadway and how they are cast with regard to the race of the actors. And they point out year after year after year that white people are overrepresented on our stages. And that there are actually a lot of Black actors on stage. And so like you can't use that as an excuse. I'm also reminded though of an anecdote from Charles Randolph Wright, who's a playwright. And I think he wrote the book for the musical Motown. And he talked once at the Black Theater Network conference about how a producer from the Book of Mormon complained about all of our Black actors are leaving our show to go be in Motown. And Charles Randolph Wright was like, well, maybe because they want to wear shoes. So this is again speaks to like, what are the available roles? And, it's a paycheck, but it's also like an actor's dignity. And I don't necessarily, put the blame or responsibility on actors for what they decide to do, because again, you have to survive. But that's why we have to look at these larger structures, which I think that we're doing really well in this class today. Issa is pointing out, echoing what Isaiah had said earlier, theater is an institution filled with privilege, affected by money. Those who can afford to see musicals tend to be the privileged and the rich. That's absolutely true. We also have statistics from the Broadway League, which gives us the demographics of Broadway theater goers, and the typical Broadway theater goer has a graduate degree, and if I remember correctly, has a household income of more than $200,000. So that actually puts you, I believe, in about the top 5% income bracket for the United States. All right, Professor Edmondson Spencer is pointing out, there's a question from the YouTube live chat stream. While I celebrate Hamilton, it is still a glorification of white individuals who owned enslaved people and fought to destroy indigenous people who have the true right to this land. How do we move past this? Yeah, I mean, isn't that the question? So I guess I'll say first, I think that it's the reality that we can take pleasure in musicals like Hamilton. I love Hamilton, but I also hate Hamilton. I also love to hate Hamilton. So it's okay for us to acknowledge the joy that we get from musicals. And sometimes it's life-sustaining to find those pockets of joy, especially when we live in this world of systemic violence every day and we're just trying to like get through. And on the other hand, though, it's important for us to acknowledge the violences of a show like Hamilton. And so again, it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's that I like this and I see that it has these problems. And to be honest, sometimes I like it because I'm embedded in the problems. And that's a really hard step to recognize, that we are really embedded in racism. We're embedded in American nationalism. We're taught to love this country. And so when I see Philippa Sue, another mixed Asian white woman on stage, I'm like bawling from that kind of representation because it makes me feel included in this country. And at the same time, I recognize she was an enslaver. And is this really what I aspire to? I have higher aspirations. I don't want to be, a founding father. I don't want to be an enslaver or a rapist or someone complicit with Indigenous genocide. So I think what this provocative and really honest question that we have to ask ourselves gets also to, if we're going to move past it, part of it is making new work. And at the same time, acknowledging that when we do make new work, that doesn't necessarily escape systemic white supremacy or capitalism or hetero-cis patriarchy, but it's a step in thinking about what are these new worlds that we can imagine in our art, and therefore, what are the new worlds that we can imagine in our lives? And so we can think about theater as a kind of rehearsal for liberation and other ways of imagining communities beyond the ones that we already have. And so that's why I also try to end the essay in this click boom way of like, maybe instead of trying to get more people into the room where it happens, because it's a terrible room. Like, why would I want to be invited to a terrible party? So instead it's like, maybe we should explode the room and like make a different room that's actually, maybe it doesn't have walls, right? Maybe everyone can be there. Maybe we change the ground on which it stands. So it really liberates our imagination to think about, maybe it doesn't have to be this way. And then you figure out, how can I get to there? Thanks so much for the affirmations too. This is really heartening for me, because sometimes when one offers these kinds of critiques, you get a lot of pushback because of people just being really intransigent and embedded in these power structures. Because again, we've been taught that this is normal and this is what we should have. I'm seeing a critique here that I think is being reflective of the program that you're all in. So Alicia is saying that UCF tries to be inclusive in picking shows with only people of color, but perhaps there are very few people of color in the program to do the show. And so sometimes it sounds like UCF students of color are forced to do a show they don't want to do, instead of UCF just choosing a quote unquote normal season, which I presume means like white roles, a white authored show, and casting people of color in roles that they could thrive in that don't require a certain race or would traditionally be white casting. That's inclusion and diversity, casting whoever is best for the role and not who looks like the cartoon character or original Broadway actor. And so I hear what Alicia is saying. And again, this gets back to what are the terms of inclusion? And so often what we're taught to believe is you can be included if you follow the rules and you kind of adhere to playing these white roles, because we've been taught that those are the best roles, that those are universal stories. And so sometimes we have to like decolonize our thinking about that and acknowledge also, like, just so you know, actors of color, when you go out into the professional world, most of the time you're actually playing characters related to your own racial identity. It's actually very rare for people of color to be cast in a Shakespeare play, for example. It might seem like it's common, it's not statistically, and the report that I linked to shows you that. And so it also begs the question, though, that in our educational institutions, like, I understand the concern of like, again, it doesn't have to be either or. Like, shouldn't you cast students of color in these canonical white works, but also cast them to be true to their own experiences? Because that's what's going to actually give them a more well-rounded resume and experience to hone their craft for their world, and, you know, honing who you are as a human being and not denying the specific experiences of people of color. So again, I totally get the concerns here, and again, think it can be both at the same time. And I'd also recognize Brian Herrera has another excellent essay called The Myth of the Best Actor for the Role. And so he points out, kind of like what I was doing in citing those studies about resumes and homework assignments, that we think that people who are the best are the ones who are rewarded. But actually, because we've internalized all of these biases, we continue to reward mediocrity because we've been taught to see people with certain faces as inherently better. And so instead, it's more productive to acknowledge our biases and then try to counteract that and acknowledge that, you know, someone who might not seem like the best, maybe they secretly are the best, but they just haven't been given the chance to shine before. And so this is also to recognize, you know, there's all kinds of excellence. It's just that some people, like on a systematic level, just haven't been given a chance to show their excellence before. And thanks to Professor Edmondson Spencer for pointing out Brian Herrera's article. Yeah, so he's like a leader in the field for talking about casting, so I highly recommend his work as well. All right, this has been a very invigorating conversation. So I wanted to then, I guess, ask, do you have more questions for me about my article? And then we'll conclude by thinking about how does Hamilton relate to other musicals or theater histories with which you're familiar, so we can make those connections. And then we'll conclude by thinking about, like, what does this show mean today? So first, what questions do you have for me?
This is kind of like, I mean, it's a question, but it's kind of a personal question. Did you write this like on your own personal will? Like you were like, this is something I want to write about? Or was it something that like, it kind of came upon you and you were like, this might be something to discuss, and then you started pinpointing and mapping and blueprinting and then started coming up with something to like prove something to someone, or I guess, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think it was a little of both. So first, I saw the show at the Public Theater, and you know, I was just blown away by it. And I remember just coming out of it thinking, like, wait, did all this really happen? Like, was Hamilton really an abolitionist? And just thinking through those feelings of inclusion that I had that really moved me to tears. But at the same time, one was like, I'm very uncomfortable with how quickly all the white people in the audience jumped to their feet to applaud this show at the end. I've never experienced that before in my life. Like, it felt very self-congratulatory. So I came out of the show directly with all of these questions about, like, what does this mean? What happened historically? What does it mean that they're trying to tell history in this way? What does the casting mean? And I originally wasn't going to write about it because I assumed that there was going to be so much writing about it. And specifically, I thought that there were going to be critiques about how the show is just so nationalist and really believes that if you just work hard, you'll succeed, and is just using the people of color to like rationalize these systems of inequality. And then it turned out like, nope, everyone just wrote about how much they love the show. And I was commissioned to write a review of the show. And so that was the first piece where I wrote about how I really loved it, but I have all these concerns. And then one of my mentors from graduate school, Professor David Savrin, just said to me at a conference, he was like, Donatella, you are the only person I trust to write about this. And I was like, damn it, David, you're making me write this article. Now I have to do all this work. I was just hoping someone else was gonna do it. So it's because like someone basically asked me to do this and no one else seemed to be stepping up to do it, that's when I started doing more research and thinking to try to collect all my evidence for the argument that I was like building. And then around the same time, like 2018 was finally when we started seeing in print more of these critiques of Hamilton. And so I think that shows that a bunch of us like did have these thoughts. It just takes a while to kind of percolate, and publishing in academia takes a really long time. It can take just years from the first time you write a draft to when it finally gets out in print. So yeah, it was, I didn't want to do it originally, but then was like, oh, I guess I have to. And I'm really grateful that I did. And I've had a lot of opportunities like in this class right now to continue thinking about the show. And just, I actually I gave a talk about Hamilton 4 years ago, the day after the 2016 presidential election. So this is just like a theme. I guess I'm going to do this in 4 years again. And specifically, I was thinking about like, how does it resonate with the historical moment and why do people like it so much? And that's often a driving question for me in my research. When something's very popular, I'm like, why? And it's both because the show is good, but it's also because there's something going on with the politics and the ideology of it. So that's often like what I'm researching. Oh, the earlier comment, I think from Isaiah about commerce and art reminds me that another like flop show on Broadway, which I thought was actually good and no one else thinks it's good, was Holler If You Hear Me, which was this Tupac Shakur musical that was like almost entirely like Black cast. And it was so amazing. It was this like great indictment of the prison industrial complex. And it turns out people who go to Broadway don't want to see that, and they don't really want to listen to Tupac, like shocker. So again, these questions about like, what are people like actually willing to pay for? Anyway, thanks for that question. I love talking about process.
No, thank you, because that was amazing, honestly. And you're so researched and you know so much, and honestly, it's inspirational to see you like be so passionate about it, because me and my boyfriend are passionate about it in our own ways, and just to see you like really have that extensive research is amazing.
Thank you so much, Emily, for saying that. And I'll say that, part of it is because like when you're a person of color encountering white nonsense, you have to be very well prepared with receipts, because people often don't believe you. There's a really interesting book called Presumed Incompetent about women of color in academia, how we're often presumed to be undergraduate students or staffers who don't belong there, who aren't professors. So you have to like constantly like overcome or like deal with that presumption. And so one of my tactics often when dealing with, people who basically support systems of power as they are is to just be like, well, here are a bunch of facts. And, they can either be like, yep, I understand those facts and I'm still okay with supporting this terribleness. Or they have to actually confront like, oh, maybe I don't want to be part of this. And so like, on the one hand, it's really unfair that some of us are asked to actually to do so much more work and to be so much more exceptional just to get a job and like survive. And on the other hand, like you kind of just have to do it. So, thank you so much for seeing that. It's hard, but it's okay. And there's actually, for me, a lot of joy and pleasure in being able to just like spitfire these kinds of studies and stats and analyses.
Spitfire is definitely a word that I think of when I think of Donatella. Amazing. I want to be mindful of your time. I want to be mindful of Katie's eating hours. Maybe she's getting a little hungry, but unless are there any other closing thoughts that the class wants to sort of bring in? We've run over, but I wanted to let this conversation develop because it really got good there. But are there any other? I love this idea of like new futurities imagined through art, Donatella, like that. I really needed to hear that today. So thank you so much for bringing that. But any other thoughts, y'all?
Yeah, is there anything else that you want to ask about to connect it with other musicals or connecting it to our moments today?
It's gonna be me again because I'm annoying. Sorry. Do you have like a YouTube page or podcast or anything that I could just like hear more of your wisdom and output on other theater productions and whatnot?
Why don't I send a roundup of a couple of things to your professor to share with you? But yeah, I've done a couple of podcasts recently, and I don't know if you assigned the Feeling Yellow essay, but I think that's a really good one for students as well to learn about yellowface, which is my current project when white people pretend to be stereotypical Asians and why they still get away with doing it.
I will definitely be sharing that out with y'all after this, so we can do even more reading. Yay! Awesome, y'all. Anything else? Yeah, I wish that too, Gigi, that everyone that has seen Hamilton could read Donatella's article. It's a wild ride of a read for sure. Any closing thoughts, Donatella? Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. It's been an incredible, or I guess it's morning in California, but thank you so much for the gift of your time and knowledge.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me and for welcoming and accommodating little Arcadia here today. And, it's a real pleasure to speak with you, and just speaking with students helps to energize me, and it helps me not give up hope about possibilities for real structural change to make a more equitable world that honestly would benefit all of us. So, thank you for this rich conversation and for in turn just like inspiring and motivating me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, students. You are the future. All right, that's it for today. We will tune back in a few weeks, and stay tuned for future theater history open classes. I'm hoping to find some other fantastic folks. If you have any suggestions, send me an email at chloe.edmondson@ucf.edu, and we'll bring some